One last thing I want to tackle before we move on to talking about managed files is using the private file system. So what we're going to do is take everything that we've built so far, and we're just going to convert it over to using the private file system instead of the public. Now what this means is that, one, we need to use a different URI every time. Currently, where we use public : we need to use private : and then the second part is that we need to deal with the download through a PHP script. So we're going to use a hook function in order to tap into Drupal's system for handling those private files. Okay, go ahead and go to your steps directory in the assets folder, and we want to open up the 9th step, which is called unmanaged private files. Go ahead and copy the entire code and paste it over your current assets.module file and save it. Okay, now I'm going to do a quick search in here for every place that public used to be used because we've replaced it with private, and I just want to show you every place where we've done that. Okay, so our first place is here. This is in our assets unmanaged file form submit, so the submit function for our upload form. We're changing the directory name from public to private. Our next one is down here in assets display unmanaged files page, again where we set the directory. We've changed the public here to private. So I'm using a hotkey Control-G in my editor to jump to the next match. Okay, so we see here in assets unmanaged delete callback, we have a couple calls that have been changed to private. In our unmanaged delete recursive, so this is when we're deleting all the files. And then we're checking our file here to make sure that our initial directory is right, so we're not deleting anything outside of our directory. So we want to change these both to private. And that was it. So we had 4 places. Now one thing that we could do if we were going to make this module a little bit more flexible is set that and use that throughout all of the different functions so that we can easily switch between public and private files, for example. Okay, the other part that we've added to this is a hook call here, function assets file download, and then we're passing it a URI. So this is an implementation of hook file download. And this hook gets called whenever Drupal is responsible for serving up a private file. What happens with public files is that when the user requests it from a browser, say, the server takes care of sending that file to the browser. It's a direct connection to the file itself. When we need to check access permissions before we deliver a file, which is typically why we would use the private file system, either to check for a purchase or check for a particular user role, then Drupal hands the process of delivering that file off to a PHP script. Before that PHP script is called, this hook is called, hook file download, to see if any modules have anything to say about the type of file that's being delivered and anything to say about checking access control beforehand. So there's 2 parts to this. The first part is that we want to do the access control check, for example, check to see if the current user has a particular role. And then the second part is adding some information about the file so that the client, for instance the browser, knows how to interpret it. And this is communicated through the use of headers. When a hook file download is called, it's expected to return one of 2 values. One is either an array of headers that gives metadata about the file that's about to be sent, or it returns a -1, which means that permission should not be granted for this particular file. Let's go ahead and take a look at this line by line. Probably one of the most interesting things to me about this function is that it gets passed a single parameter, which is the URI to the file that we're going to be working with. So it doesn't contain any data even if the file is managed and there's an entry in the database. There's no information about that. All we get is the path. And that is actually enough to perform anything that we need to in terms of validation. It sometimes takes some additional work though. So what we're going to do is check to see what the file name is, and we're doing so by using a function called file URI target. And what this will do is take the schema out of the URI and just leave the rest. So we saw some functions in the past that allow us to identify what the schema is, and this is basically the opposite and allows us to remove the schema and just take the path. The reason we want this path is because every file that is in the private file system is going to be run through this hook. So we want to make sure before we perform any access control or deny access that this is a file that this module is responsible for, should have some say in. The way that we're doing that for this is by checking the directory that the file resides in. We know that all of the files that we're responsible for are in the assets/unmanaged directory. So we're pulling the schema out of the URI and then checking that the first part of the file path, which is the directory, is assets/unmanaged. If so, then we're going to go ahead and continue our logic. We can do anything at this point for validation, but what we're going to do to keep it simple is to just check for a simple permission. We're checking for a permission called view assets using the user access function, which you've seen before when we talked about the menu system. And the idea here is that users without this permission won't be able to access this file. Now we haven't added this permission via a hook permissions function, so the only user that will pass this test is user 1, or the first user that was created when Drupal was installed. So if you're following along and using a different user, you might want to switch over now so that this processes correctly. Now again, the return value from this function should either be an array of headers or a -1 if the validation didn't get passed. We can also pass an empty array for the headers if another module is going to be taking care of the headers for this particular file. But if we're responsible for it, and in this case we are, we need to supply some headers in order to tell the browser what to do when it tries to access the file. There's a handy function in Drupal, and I'm just going to scroll down to it now, called file get content headers, which will take a file object and return an array of headers, default headers that can be used for a return value from the hook file download function. This is pretty handy because it can be difficult to figure out what kind of headers are needed for what kinds of files. So this is like a shortcut. The value that we need to pass to it, because it's a file object, is a little bit more geared towards managed files where the file object contains a bunch of metadata by default. So in order to use this, we need to build up that metadata a little bit before we pass it to file get content headers. So we're starting out here with a new instance of standard class, which is basically an empty class that we can use to be a holder for particular properties. So this is a great way to start out an empty file object, or if you're working with a node or a user, you can do the same thing. We're assigning the file name to base name of the URI. So this takes the ending aspect of the path, so anything past that last slash, which would be the file name, and assigns it to the file name property of the file object. Next, we're grabbing the URI that was passed through the hook function and assigning it to the URI property. We need to pass a file MIME, which is the MIME type for the file. If you're not sure what MIME types are, it's basically a way for a client to distinguish between a different type of file. So there might be a MIME type for an image file, like a JPEG, but a different one for a video file, and that tells the browser what to do, how to react to that particular file. Next, we're grabbing the file size by using the PHP function file size against the URI. And then finally, we're returning the headers from file get content headers. Now, if the user doesn't have this permission, we want to make sure that they don't get access. So we're returning a -1 for that. Otherwise, we're not returning anything. So if the file path doesn't match the file path of the files that this module is managing, then you see down here we're not returning anything. It's just blank. We're not taking a vote on this particular file.